The stage depot at Millhaven smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, and on the morning Vera Calloway arrived, there were 11 people waiting on the platform who had no particular reason to be there, except that word had gone ahead of her on the early freight. She stepped down from the coach with a leather satchel over one shoulder and a wooden camera case in her other hand, the case banded in brass and worn at the corners, in the way of something carried a long distance more than once. She was not tall. Her coat was clean but thin for the altitude, and her boots had been resoled at least once by someone who knew what they were doing. She set both items down on the platform boards and looked at the town the way a person looks at arithmetic they are not sure adds up. The man who had sent for her was not there. That was the first thing. The second thing was Aldous Greer. He came off the far end of the platform with his hat already in his hand, which was the way he always moved when he was preparing to perform a kindness that was not one. He was the kind of man who owned 3 parcels of land and spent most of his time standing on other people's. He had a wide, easy face and the particular confidence of someone who had never needed to develop patience. He stopped in front of Vera and looked at the camera case the way men like him always looked at things they had already decided were not worth the room they took up. He said there had been a change of plans. He said the man who had written to her, one Thomas Aldrich, had reconsidered the arrangement. He said this in a voice that was careful and public and designed to be heard by the 11 people who had no reason to be there. He said the position had been filled. Vera stood with her chin level in the way of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. She did not ask why. She did not look at the people watching. She looked at Aldous Greer and she said, quietly, that she had a contract. He said contracts were sometimes written before circumstances were fully understood. She said nothing to that. There was nothing to say to it that would help her. And she had learned some years ago that the things you say in public to men like Aldous Greer do not help you. They become the story instead of the facts. She picked up her satchel and her camera case, and she stepped off the platform and stood in the street in front of Millhaven, which was a town of perhaps 400 people arranged around a main road that ran north toward the mountains and south toward nothing much in particular. The cold came down off the ridge behind the buildings, and the sky was the flat white of a day that could not decide what it intended. She had come from Laramie. Before that, Cheyenne. Before that, a place in eastern Kansas where she had grown up in a county home that fed children adequately and taught them little, and released them at 16 with a small parcel of practical skills and no particular warmth. She had taught herself to use a camera from a manual she had read 3 times in a dry goods storeroom where she worked at 17. She had been hired twice and let go once when the studio owner's wife decided the arrangement was inappropriate, and let go the second time when the business failed in the way of businesses that were never quite sound. She had done survey photography for a land assessor in Wyoming for 2 years, which was where she had learned that a photograph could be evidence. She had answered Thomas Aldrich's advertisement in a Cheyenne paper because it described a need for someone who could document land features and property lines for a ranch operation that was expanding toward contested territory. She had answered it because it was work, and because work was the only thing she had ever had that was reliably hers. She was 31 years old. She had $40 in her satchel, a full set of photographic plates, and no plan for what happened next. By the second autumn, people in Millhaven would stop calling the Harlan Marsh place a hard-luck farm. She did not know that yet. She stood in the street with her camera case in the cold and did not know any of it. The man who had been watching from across the street had been there since before the coach arrived. He had come into town for lumber and nails, and had been standing beside his wagon when the stage pulled in. And he had watched the whole of it without moving or speaking, which was not unusual for him. His name was Harlan Marsh. He was 38 years old and had the kind of face that had been weathered into something plain and permanent, the way a fence post weathers, not ruined, just settled into what it was going to be. He had a farm 6 miles north of town, on land that ran up against the base of the ridge. Good land for hay and difficult land for everything else. And he had been working it alone for 2 years, since his wife had died of a fever that came on fast and did not wait. He had 2 children. A daughter, Clara, who was 9, and had her mother's mouth and her father's way of going quiet when something mattered. A boy, Edmund, who was 6 and had not yet learned to be careful with what he felt. Harlan Marsh watched Vera Calloway stand in the street with her satchel and her camera case, and he watched her look at the town and not ask anyone for anything, and then he crossed the street. He said he had heard she was looking for survey work. She said she was. He said he had land that needed documenting. He said there was a boundary dispute working its way toward a county hearing, and he had been told a photograph could carry weight in that proceeding if it was taken correctly. He said he could not pay what a studio photographer would charge, but he could offer room and board and a fair wage for the duration of the work, which he expected to take some weeks. She looked at him. He was not performing anything. That was the thing she noticed first. She asked if he had children. He said he did. She said she was not a housekeeper. He said he was not looking for one. She said, "All right then," and picked up her satchel, and that was how it started. The wagon ride to the Marsh place took the better part of an hour on a road that was more intention than fact, rutted deep in the wet sections and rocky where it climbed toward the ridge. Harlan Marsh drove without talking, and Vera Calloway sat beside him and looked at the land, which was open and wide and had the particular quality of country that does not care whether you make something of it or not. The mountains were close enough to feel like walls. The grass was winter pale, and the creek that ran along the west side of the property was running low. She asked about the boundary dispute. He said a man named Greer had been filing claims on parcels adjacent to his north fence line, claiming the survey markers from the original land grant were incorrectly placed, which would move the boundary south and take a section of his best hay ground. She asked if he had the original survey documents. He said he had them. He said the county assessor had looked at them and said they were inconclusive without a physical record of the markers as they currently stood. He said a photograph of the markers in their original positions, cross-referenced to the documents, could establish the boundary as recorded. She said she understood that kind of work. He said he believed she did. They did not speak again until the farm came into view, which was a low house and a larger barn and several outbuildings, arranged with the practical logic of someone who had built them, one at a time, as need arose and money allowed. There was a porch on the front of the house that had one step that was visibly loose. There was a kitchen garden to the east that had been put to bed for winter under a layer of straw. There was a woodpile stacked high enough to mean something. The 2 children were at the fence when the wagon came in. The boy, Edmund, had his hands on the top rail and was leaning out over it at an angle that suggested he had been told not to. The girl, Clara, was standing straight with her arms at her sides and her face composed into a careful neutrality that was too deliberate for 9 years old. Edmund said, loudly, that she had brought a box. Harlan said it was a camera. Edmund asked what a camera was for. Harlan said for taking photographs. Edmund considered this and said he had seen a photograph once and the man in it had looked like he was thinking about something sad. Clara said nothing. She looked at Vera with the measuring patience of a child who has learned that new things in the house are not always good things, and that it is better to wait before deciding. Vera set her camera case down on the porch and looked at the loose step and then looked at the children. She said hello to them, plainly, not with the brightness that adults sometimes use on children to compensate for not knowing what else to do. She said she was going to be staying for a while and doing some work on the land, and that she would try not to be a bother. Clara said she was not a bother. It was the most careful kind of welcome. The room Harlan gave her was small and faced east and had a window that looked out toward the creek. There was a bed and a washstand and a hook on the wall and a small iron stove that he had already laid a fire in. On the washstand there was a folded cloth, plain cotton, the kind of thing you put out when you want someone to feel expected without making a ceremony of it. She put her satchel on the bed and her camera case against the wall and stood in the room for a moment, with the quiet of it around her. She had not been expected somewhere in some time. She started work the next morning. Harlan took her out to the north fence line before the frost had fully lifted, and she walked the line with him and looked at the markers, which were iron stakes driven into the ground at the survey points, some of them old enough to have settled into the earth at slight angles from the decades of freeze and thaw. She photographed each one in sequence, placing a numbered card beside each stake before she shot, the way she had learned to do in Wyoming so that the sequence could be read in order by someone who had never seen the land. She photographed the fence line itself and the natural features that the original survey documents referenced. A particular rock formation at the northeast corner, the line of the creek, a stand of pines that appeared in the original description as a bearing tree. It was slow, careful work. She moved across the ground methodically, and Harlan Marsh walked with her, and did not rush her, and answered her questions about the original survey when she had them, and did not offer information she had not asked for. By midday they had covered the north line and half the east. She was cold and her fingers were stiff from handling the plates in the open air. He had brought food in a cloth without being asked about it. Bread and dried meat and 2 cups of coffee in a covered tin that was still warm. She ate without commenting on it. He did not comment on it either. By the end of the first week, she had photographed the full boundary, developed the plates in the small space off the kitchen that Harlan had cleared for her use without being asked, and begun the work of cross-referencing the photographs to the survey documents. She worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after supper. Harlan worked at the same table on his own papers, accounts and correspondence, and they sat across from each other in the lamplight and worked in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. Clara began to appear at the table on the 3rd evening. She did not ask to look at the photographs. She sat at the end of the table with a reader and read it, and after a time she asked Vera a question about a word she did not know, and Vera told her what it meant, and Clara went back to reading. Edmund had no such patience for indirection. On the 4th morning, he appeared beside Vera while she was working with the developing chemicals and asked if he could watch. She said he could if he stood still and did not touch anything. He stood still for approximately 4 minutes and then asked if the photographs came out looking like ghosts because of the chemicals. She said not exactly, but that there was a period in the process when the image appeared out of nothing, which she supposed was a little like that. He thought about this very seriously and said that ghosts probably felt the same way about themselves, coming out of nothing, and that it might not be their fault. She did not smile, but the corner of her mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. By the 2nd week she had settled into the house the way water settles into a low place, not by force but by the simple logic of where things go when they are allowed to find their level. She cooked when she was the first one to the kitchen, not because it was expected of her, but because she had always cooked when there was a kitchen and food and people who needed to eat. She was a plain and efficient cook, not a lavish one, and the meals she made were the kind that filled a person without drawing attention to themselves. One morning, she made biscuits from a recipe she carried in her head from the county home, which had not been a warm place but had produced functional biscuits. And Edmund ate 4 of them and said with great seriousness that burnt beans were a serious matter, and he did not take them lightly, but that these were not burnt beans, and he appreciated that. Harlan said Edmund. Edmund said he was paying a compliment. Clara, without looking up from her reader, said that he was. Harlan looked at his coffee. The corner of his mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. Vera had noticed by then that he did not waste expressions. A smile from Harlan Marsh was not the same currency as a smile from other men. It was rarer and therefore worth more the way water is worth more in dry country. She noticed other things. She noticed that he had repaired the loose porch step sometime in the first week without mentioning it, and without any particular ceremony about it. Just one morning it was solid where it had been loose. She noticed that he kept the wood box beside the kitchen stove full, not just adequate, but full, which was a thing you did when you were thinking about someone else's comfort. She noticed that when she was working late at the kitchen table, he set the lamp higher without being asked, and then went back to his own work. She noticed all of it and said nothing about any of it. That was the agreement they had without having made it. The county hearing was set for the last week of February. It was now the middle of January. There was still work to do, not only the photographs, but the written account she was preparing that described the methodology of the documentation, which the county assessor had said would be necessary to establish the photographs as credible evidence, rather than simply pictures. She had written this kind of account before, in Wyoming, and she knew how to do it in the plain, exact language that official proceedings required. She was working on it one evening when Clara came and sat beside her, rather than at the end of the table, and looked at the pages. Clara asked if it was hard to write. Vera said it was not hard if you said only what you knew and did not try to say more. Clara said that her teacher had told her that good writing was about saying what you felt. Vera said that was true for some kinds of writing. She said for this kind, what mattered was what you could prove. Clara thought about this. She said that seemed lonelier. Vera looked at the page. She said sometimes it was. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then Clara went back to her end of the table, and they worked together in the lamplight without speaking. And after a time, Edmund came in from wherever he had been and fell asleep on the settle with his boots still on. And Harlan came in from the barn and looked at his son, and then at the table, and then went and took Edmund's boots off without waking him, and draped a blanket over him, and came to the table, and poured himself a cup of coffee, and sat down and worked. It was a Thursday evening in January, and the wind was coming down hard off the ridge, and the stove was working well, and the lamp was high, and the four of them were in the room together, and none of them remarked on any of it. Vera did not remark on it because she did not trust it yet. It was the kind of thing you could ruin by naming it. On a Saturday morning in the third week, she was photographing a section of the east fence line that she had not been satisfied with from the first session. The light had been wrong, and the angle had flattened the distance between the marker and the rock formation she needed to show in the same frame. She had gone out alone because the work required patience, and she had found it easier to be patient without an audience. She was setting up the camera on its tripod in the frozen grass when she heard a horse on the road and looked up and saw Aldous Greer coming along the fence line from the north. He stopped his horse and looked at her, and at the camera and at the stakes in the ground. He said she was trespassing. She said she was not. He said the land north of the fence was under his claim. She said she was south of the fence. He said she was close enough to the line that it was a matter of interpretation. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the platform, without expression, without asking for anything. She said she would be done in an hour. He sat on his horse and watched her work for a time, which was meant to be unsettling, and which she did not allow to be. She moved around the camera and adjusted the angle and checked the plate and made the exposure, and moved to the next position, and she did not look at him again. After a while he rode north, and she finished the work. She did not tell Harlan about it when she came back, but he knew something had happened. She had come back from the east fence line with a quietness that was different from her ordinary quietness, which was a working quiet, a quiet that had something in it. This was a quiet that had been put over something. He did not ask. He went out to check the east fence line himself that afternoon, and when he came back, he said nothing about it either. Nothing said. She said nothing about it either. But that evening he sat down at the kitchen table earlier than usual, and he pulled the survey documents toward him, and he worked on them with a new concentration, the kind that comes from a problem that has moved closer. It was in the fourth week that the thing happened that neither of them had words for afterward. She had been out in the cold for most of the day, doing a final verification pass along the north line, and when she came back, she was more tired than she had let herself know while she was working. She came into the kitchen and sat down at the table to write up her notes while the day was still clear in her mind, and the warmth of the kitchen came up around her, the way warmth does when you have been cold long enough. And she wrote her notes, and then she was simply still. She did not intend to fall asleep. She was not the kind of person who fell asleep in chairs. She came awake to the sound of Edmund telling Clara in a loud whisper that she was sleeping. Clara, in an equally loud whisper, said that she could see that. Edmund said they should be quiet. Clara said that was what being quiet meant. Vera lifted her head from where it had come to rest, which was against Harlan Marsh's shoulder, because he had sat down beside her at some point with his coffee and his accounts, and she had simply gone sideways against him, the way a thing goes sideways when the ground shifts. She was awake and upright in the same moment, and her face did the thing it needed to do, which was to compose itself. She said she was sorry. He said there was nothing to be sorry for. His voice was the same as it always was. That was the thing. It was the same, plain and level, not careful in the way of someone managing a moment. Just the same. She picked up her notes and went to her room and stood at the window and looked at the creek in the last of the light. Edmund, she heard through the door, asked Clara if she had seen. Clara said yes. Edmund said in a very serious voice that he thought the lady was going to stay. Clara said Edmund. Edmund said he was just saying. There was a silence, and then Clara said quietly that she thought so too. Vera stood at the window for a long time. The cold came through the glass, and the light went out of the creek, and the pines on the ridge went dark against the sky. She had not been anyone's in a long time. She had not let herself think about it in those terms because the terms had not been available to her, and she had learned not to want what was not available. She thought about it now. And then she set it aside, because the hearing was in 10 days, and there was still work to do. The trouble came from 2 directions, the way trouble usually does when it has had time to organize itself. The first was a woman named Dorothea Fenn, who ran the dry goods with her husband, and had a voice built for distance, and a concern that she kept prepared at home and brought out fresh each time she went to town. She had been watching the situation at the Marsh place with the attention of someone who considers community standards to be a personal responsibility, and she had begun saying, in the way of saying things while appearing not to say them, that it was unusual for a woman of no fixed connection to be living out on a farm with a widower and 2 children, and that she was not suggesting anything, only that people had noticed. The second was that Aldous Greer had obtained a statement from a surveyor in the next county who had reviewed the original land grant documents and was prepared to testify that the markers as currently placed were inconsistent with the original measurements, which would move the boundary south by approximately 40 yards and take with it the section of hay ground that Harlan Marsh had been working for 6 years. Harlan heard about the surveyor's statement on a Tuesday morning when he went into town for feed. He came back and told Vera about it at the kitchen table without particular expression, the way he told her most things. She asked to see the original survey documents again. She had worked with them before, but she wanted to look at something specific. He spread them on the table, and she looked at the bearing notations, and then she looked at her photographs, the sequence she had made of the northeast corner, the rock formation, the creek line, the iron stakes. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said that the surveyor's statement was wrong. She said the original documents used the creek's winter channel as a bearing reference, not its summer channel, and that the 2 differed by nearly 30 yards at the northeast corner, because the creek had cut a new summer course sometime in the past 20 years. She said her photographs showed the winter channel, which was the one running now, and that if you laid the photographs against the original, bearing notations and measured from the winter channel, the markers were exactly where they were supposed to be. Harlan looked at the photographs and the documents for a long time. He said he had not known about the creek channels. She said most people did not. She said it was the kind of thing you learned doing survey work in country where creeks moved. He said quietly that she had saved the farm. She said she had done the work she was hired to do. He looked at her. She looked at the photographs. Neither of them said anything more about it. The county hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the assessor's office, which was a single room above the land registry, with 4 chairs and a table and a window that faced the main street. There were more people than chairs. Aldous Greer was there with his surveyor and 2 other men whose function appeared to be to take up space and look like agreement. The assessor was a careful man named Hollis, who had been doing the work for 20 years and had seen most of the ways people tried to move lines that were not theirs to move. Greer's surveyor presented his measurements. He was competent and his numbers were internally consistent, and he presented them with the confidence of someone who had been paid to be confident. Then Vera Calloway laid her photographs on the table. She had mounted them in sequence on a backing board and numbered them to correspond to the notation index she had written, which was a 12-page document in plain language that described each photograph, the position from which it was taken, the feature documented, and its correspondence to the original survey description. She had also prepared a single-page summary that explained the creek channel discrepancy, with a diagram she had drawn showing the winter and summer channels and their relationship to the bearing reference in the original grant. She spoke for approximately 15 minutes. She did not raise her voice. She used the language of the work, exact and without decoration, and she pointed to each photograph as she referenced it. And she let the photographs do what photographs do, which is to show a thing as it was. Aldous Greer said that photographs could be manipulated. Hollis asked him in what specific way he believed these had been. Greer said he was not a photographer and could not say specifically. Hollis looked at the photographs and the documentation and at Greer for a moment, and then he said that the photographs, taken in conjunction with the original survey documents and the methodology account, established the boundary markers as consistent with the original land grant. He said the boundary claim as filed by Greer was not supported by the evidence before him. He said it plainly and without drama and wrote something in his ledger. The room was quiet, the way a room is quiet when something has been decided that cannot be undecided. Greer put his hat on and left without speaking. His surveyor followed him. The 2 men whose function had been to take up space took up space in the doorway for a moment, and then were gone. Harlan Marsh was standing at the back of the room. He had not spoken during the proceeding. He had stood with his arms at his sides and watched Vera Calloway lay out the evidence and speak to it, and his face had done the thing it sometimes did, which was to go very still when something mattered. He looked at her across the room when Hollis closed his ledger. She looked back at him. There was nothing to say in that room with those people that would have been the right thing, and they both knew it. And so neither of them said anything, and that was the right thing. They walked out into the main street of Millhaven, which was February, cold and bright with a thin, high sun, and the people on the street were the kind of people who had been watching the situation develop and who now adjusted themselves accordingly, the way a town adjusts when it has been watching to see which way a thing will go, and the thing has gone. Dorothea Fenn was coming out of the dry goods, and she saw them, and her face did something complicated. And she said good morning in a voice that was not exactly warm, but was not what it had been. It was as close to an apology as such people give. They walked to the wagon, and Harlan helped her up without making a ceremony of it, the way he did most things, and they drove north toward the farm in the cold, bright morning. He said, after a while, that she had done a remarkable thing. She said she had done the work. He said yes. He said that was what he meant. They were quiet for a time. The road ran north toward the mountains, and the sky was very large above the open country, and the light was the thin, clear light of a winter day that is not going to get any warmer but is honest about it. He said her name. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. He said he had been thinking about what came after the hearing. He said the work she had been hired for was done, and he knew that. He said he had no claim on her time or her plans, and he wanted to say that plainly before he said the rest. He said the rest in the same voice he used for everything, level and plain and without ornament. He said he was asking her to stay, permanent, as his wife, if that was what she would want. He said he was not asking her to decide now or to decide for his sake, or for the children's sake, though he would not pretend the children were not part of it because they were. He said he was asking because the farm was a better place with her in it, and because he was a man who had carried too much alone for long enough, that he had stopped noticing the weight until it had been lighter for a while, and now he noticed. He said she could have as much time as she needed to think on it, and that whatever she decided he would drive her wherever she needed to go, and help her, however he could. He stopped talking, and the road was quiet under the wheels, and the cold air moved through the open country. She looked at the mountains for a while. She thought about the county home in Kansas, and the dry goods storeroom, and the 2 positions she had held, and the survey work in Wyoming, and the platform at Millhaven, and the loose step that was no longer loose, and the lamp that was always higher than she had set it, and the folded cloth on the washstand, and Clara at the end of the table, and Edmund's theory about ghosts, and the weight of a shoulder in a warm kitchen on a cold evening. She said yes. She said it simply, and then she said, "That is what I want." He nodded. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "All right." And the way he said it was not the way you say all right when something is settled. It was the way you speak to someone you are coming back to. They drove the rest of the way to the farm in the kind of quiet that is not empty. By the time the frost settled in for good that year, the Marsh place had a different quality to it that was hard to name if you had not been watching it accumulate. The kitchen garden had been replanned for spring, with a section added for medicinal herbs that Vera had grown before and knew the use of. The east room had been rearranged to give her work a permanent space. A table under the east window where the morning light came in good and long, and the camera case sat on a shelf above it. Brass fittings polished, no longer worn at the corners in the way of something waiting to be carried somewhere else. Clara had taken to sitting at that table in the afternoons to do her schoolwork, not because she had been invited to, but because it was a good table in good light, and Vera was usually there, and the quality of the quiet in that room was the kind that helped you think. Edmund had asked, sometime in early March, if he could call her something other than Miss Calloway, which was what his father had told him to call her, and which he found effortful. He said he was not trying to be rude. He was just reporting a fact about the word. She had looked at him for a moment and said that was fine. He said what should he call her? She said he could call her Mama if he wanted to. He said he wanted to. Clara had been at the end of the table when this happened. She did not look up from her reader, but after a moment she said, without particular inflection, that she thought she would too. Vera looked at the page in front of her, and the lines on it blurred for a moment and then steadied. She said that was fine. It was fine in the way of something that is so much more than fine that the word is the only one that will hold it without breaking. The photographs from the boundary documentation were kept in a folder in the bottom drawer of the work table, cross-referenced and indexed the way she had been trained to keep evidence. The county assessor had asked for copies, which she had made and delivered, and the originals were hers. She looked at them sometimes, not often, just occasionally when she was working at the table in the morning light. They were good photographs. The markers were clear, and the bearing features were clear, and the creek ran in its winter channel exactly where the original survey said it would, and the land was Harlan's land and would stay that way. The camera case on the shelf was not waiting anymore. That was the difference. It had been carried a long way and set down in a place that was going to hold it, and the brass fittings caught the morning light and gave it back without asking anything in return. Aldous Greer had not filed any further claims on adjacent parcels. He had not spoken to either of them directly since the hearing. He was still in Millhaven, still on his 3 parcels of land, still occasionally visible on the main street with his hat in his hand. He simply stopped, which was as close to an apology as such a man gives. Dorothea Fenn had brought a covered dish to the farm in April, which she left on the porch with a note that said she hoped the family was well. The note said, family. She had not been asked to use that word. She used it anyway, which was its own kind of accounting. The town had watched and stored it up and adjusted, the way towns do when they have been wrong about something, and would rather not say so directly, but cannot quite go on as before. On a morning in May, when the light was coming in, long and warm, through the east window and the kitchen garden was showing its first green, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the sound of it came through the open door, Vera Marsh sat at the work table with a cup of coffee and looked at the land through the window. Harlan was in the barn. Clara was at school. Edmund was somewhere in the yard, making the kind of noise that meant he was content. The camera case was on the shelf above the table. The folder of boundary photographs was in the bottom drawer. On the table was a new letter from a land assessor in the next county who had heard about her work at the Millhaven hearing and wanted to know if she was available for survey documentation on a disputed water rights case. She read the letter and set it down and looked out the window at the land, which was her land now, or she was its, which amounted to the same thing. She picked up her coffee. The morning held its warmth around her, not waiting for anyone, not anymore. And that was the story of Vera Calloway, a woman who arrived in Millhaven with a camera and a contract that had been taken from her, and who proved, in the end, that the most important thing a photograph can do is show the truth of where a line was always meant to be. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.